Hello and welcome back to Codex Lee. My name is Lee and this is a channel all about books. Today I am going to talk about Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement by John Lewis. As many of you will know, Congressman Lewis sadly passed away quite recently. The right to vote was something that John Lewis fought for throughout his entire life, and he chronicles that struggle, and particularly the early years of that struggle, in this memoir. And it's a brilliant, brilliant book. It begins, as you'd expect, with his childhood. And it was really shocking to read about his experiences as a child of just 6 years old, being brought out into the cotton fields by his parents. He describes how half of the bale would be taken by the landowner, and most of the rest was taken as payment for the supplies such as seed, fertilizer, and equipment. He writes, "It was never enough. I could see that from the beginning. Even a 6-year-old could tell that this sharecropper's life was nothing but a bottomless pit." And this really informs his view of America and his role in American society, the role of Black Americans at this time, and is really the beginning of his political awakening. Years later, when he is a teenager, he's at college, and he learns about how the old colonial powers are falling away in parts of Africa. And he comments on this by saying that here were Black people thousands of miles away, achieving liberation and independence from nations that had ruled them for centuries. And we still didn't have those rights in a country that was supposed to be free. But things were beginning to change, and John Lewis comments extensively on the campaign, the US presidential campaign of 1960, and really portrays this as a turning point in the relationship between Black Americans and the Democratic Party. He notes how when Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested at a sit-in in Atlanta in October 1960, it forced the two presidential candidates to respond to this particular event. Nixon, who of course was running against JFK in that year, said no comment in response to this incident. But Kennedy's campaign abandoned neutrality when Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, called the judge who had sentenced King, and he urged the judge to let King go. And then King was released the following day, and the Kennedy campaign made great political capital out of this. It's notable, of course, that JFK won the popular vote by less than 1%, and this moment arguably began the Democrats' association with Black voters that perseveres to this day. And then, of course, the GOP's political direction was defined really in opposition to this moment. So that's part of the political backdrop in the beginning of the 1960s as this movement was getting underway, or certainly the part of this movement that John Lewis was involved in. Then things really begin to accelerate quite rapidly, and there are a series of horrific events that he narrates from a first-person perspective. He was there, he saw these things. He was studying in Nashville, and there was a restaurant there, the Crystal Restaurant, and he and his fellow activist Jim Bevel decided to sit at the diner counter in the Crystal Restaurant. This wasn't the first time they'd done this, but there was an immediate response. The restaurant owner ushered everybody out, locked the front door, he went to the back door, he flipped a switch, and then he closed and locked the back door. And it turned out that the manager had switched on the fumigator, and the restaurant began filling up with toxic fumes with these two men locked inside. He describes an even more horrific scene in the spring of 1961, when John Lewis, and his fellow Freedom Riders arrive at the Montgomery, Alabama terminal. The federal law dictated that segregation was unconstitutional, and that people of colour should be allowed to ride the buses just as white people were riding the buses. So they were essentially testing this law in practice by riding buses through different states in the South. When they got to Montgomery in Alabama, they were savaged by a crowd of hundreds of people, and that crowd included men, women, children. And after the crowd had attacked the Freedom Riders quite savagely, the crowd grew and they went further. They set cars on fire. They roamed the surrounding neighbourhoods to beat any black person that they could find, soaking one black person they found in kerosene and setting him aflame. And there is a picture of John Lewis and a fellow activist looking bloody and beaten up, if you'd like to see that. But he continued. He and the other activists, after being beaten up in Montgomery, they continued into the deep, deep South, and he writes about what he saw as he got to Mississippi. Now I was here in Mississippi, and it was unsettling seeing crowds of onlookers standing by the roadside, held back by those armed troops, some of whom wore big bushy beards that made them look like Confederate soldiers. It turned out that they were Confederate soldiers in a way. They were members of a Civil War reenactment group that had been preparing to stage one of their gatherings when they were called up for duty by the Guard. And of course Mississippi was in the news quite recently when they decided to change their state flag. For those of you who don't know, until they change it, which should be forthcoming, the Mississippi state flag includes the Confederate symbol. Here's a picture of it. Anyway, so the Freedom Riders get to Mississippi, and Lewis and the others he's travelling with, they're arrested, and they end up at the notorious Parchman farm. I never knew about this place before reading this book and reading Lewis's first-hand account of being held at this jail. Parchman farm is, to all intents and purposes, a concentration camp. There's no other way of describing what this place was. It still exists as a jail today, but there were true horrors that were occurring in this place. He describes how the women activists were kept in another building, and he describes how one of the women miscarried while a prison guard watched and did nothing. One of those women who was held at Parchman at this time chronicled the events that occurred there and her experiences in hidden scraps of paper that she smuggled out. And you can read this in a book called Freedom Rider Diary, Smuggled Notes from Parchman Prison by Ruth Silver. What was also really interesting about reading this memoir is Lewis was very honest about the differences within the movement as well. This wasn't a completely unified movement. There were intergenerational differences between SNCC, the SNCC, which is the organisation that he co-founded, and the NAACP, which was a much longer-standing civil rights organisation. But there were also philosophical differences. Newer members of the SNCC, they believed in self-defence, whereas the founding members were, strong advocates of non-violence. It was a philosophy that they had been taught before embarking upon their activism, and something they believed in very strongly as a way of life. So there were differences here that were both intergenerational and philosophical. And later in the movement there are differences in racial differences as well. There are white members of the SNCC who are viewed with a degree of suspicion by black members of the SNCC. That skepticism was not something that John Lewis ever expressed or found any favour with. He believed that anybody who wanted to contribute to this movement should be allowed to do so. He was also not afraid to be critical of Dr. King, especially in the way that he describes how King kind of posits himself as a messiah figure at one point when talking about his reasons for not joining the Freedom Riders. He decides not to join them, although he does publicly support them and sees them off at the bus in Montgomery. But he does say, "I think I should choose the time and place of my Golgotha," and Lewis does criticise him for this. And I think that's important because it reminds us that these people were human. They were not flawless, but that doesn't diminish the importance of what they were doing and the bravery that they showed in doing it over and over again. As he moves into the mid-1960s, things move more and more into the political sphere. A real key rupture, as he sees it, occurs at the 1964 Democratic Convention. He talks about the grassroots activist Fannie Hamer, who spoke before the Credentials Committee at the Democratic Convention that year. And listening to her words, they convey a similar theme to that expressed by James Baldwin at the Cambridge debate that occurs actually a year later. And I talk about that debate and the book about that debate quite extensively in another video, which you can watch there if you'd like to. I found a recording of Fannie Hamer's speech online, and I'm going to play you a section of that, which is where you see the similarities to the James Baldwin speech.
Is this America? the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America. Thank you.
So what Fannie Lou Hamer and others were trying to do was to replace the current block of delegates from Mississippi, the Democratic delegates from Mississippi who were segregationists, with a new block of black delegates called the NFDP. In order to do this, they needed to be on the convention floor in order to participate in a vote, but Lyndon Johnson maneuvered to ensure that they wouldn't be able to replace the Mississippi regular delegates on the convention floor. He was fearful that he would lose the South by allowing this vote to take place. The irony, of course, is that he lost the South anyway to Barry Goldwater, and only the South, but he lost something else. John Lewis believes that he lost the faith of the people by doing this. A disillusionment he traces right up to the time of writing. He really believed that, as he says, the spirit of cynicism and suspicion and mistrust that infects the attitude of many Americans towards their government today began, I firmly believe, that week in Atlantic City. We then move into a real pivotal moment in the civil rights fight, which was the march from Selma. If you don't know much about this, and I didn't know much about this until just a few years ago, I do recommend watching the film, Selma, which is brilliant. But a moment that really stood out to me wasn't so much the Bloody Sunday event itself, or all of the horrors that occurred around that time in Selma, but was after they actually completed the walk. They arrived near Montgomery. They were walking from Selma to Montgomery, and they arrived near Montgomery and they're treated to an outdoor concert featuring the likes of Tony Bennett, Sammy Davis Jr., and Lewis provides this amazing detail that the makeshift stage that they all performed on was, as he says, fashioned from stacks of coffins loaned by a local black funeral home. Yes, coffins. It's an amazing detail. And then we move into this really important moment in 1965, the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act on August 6. Lewis describes this as a culmination, a climax, the end of a very long road. In a sense, it represented a high point in modern America, probably the nation's finest hour in terms of civil rights. It had been Selma that held us together as long as we did. After that, we came apart. It's worth remembering that in 1968, three things happened that set back the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States. And really, I'd argue that this is the world that America has inherited in large part, and not, sadly, the optimism of the March on Washington and the Voting Rights Act. And I was really dumbfounded to read how the Voting Rights Act was not a permanent piece of legislation. There was no guarantee that it would be renewed in 1975. Thankfully, it was. The events after 1968, Lewis doesn't spend a great deal of time on this. He only devotes the last sort of 75 pages of this 475-page book to the years after 1968. And given that his memoirs were published in 1998, that's quite a long period of time. But his experiences after the end of the civil rights movement are portrayed as simply, I think, less significant. And the struggles after 1968 are much less straightforward in a way. Many of the struggles after 1968 in Lewis's life were political. He sought elected office, and eventually he won that. He won a congressional seat in Georgia, which he kept until the time of his death just a couple of months ago. And I'd like to end on what he said as his pitch to the voters in 1986. This reads to me as a summation of his entire life, and he said, "When you needed someone to sit in, I would say I was there. When you needed someone to ride, I was there. When you needed someone to march, I was there. And now, when you need someone with vision and strength to represent you in Washington, I will be there."